The biggest, toughest, scariest men are usually the most terrified. And it's because the seeds that are bearing that fruit of being a hard, tough guy, those seeds are based from having a very tough life. The hardest, toughest people usually have some of the hardest, toughest lives. And it's because when they're a child or when they're in a position of vulnerability, something or a series of things happen to them that are so terrible, so shameful, so painful that they decide that's never going to happen to me again. I'm going to make sure that no one has control over me or my environment ever again. And as a method of survival to stay alive, they decide consciously or unconsciously, I have to be a big, hard, tough dude, because if I'm not, somebody's going to come and hurt me again. And so that's why I have to stay tough. That's why I have to stay big. And when you see the irony and the sadness that's in that contrast, that an extreme lack of control and security in their life has then led to another extreme sense of control and a false idea of security, because that's not real control. That's not real security. And it's because that survival mentality, the equation that they've used to build their worldview, is a child's equation. It came from a child when they were a young child. And so it doesn't work in an adult world. And it gets along, but it's not really functional. It's very maladaptive. And when you consider that well-adjusted, mature, responsible adults actually act in kindness. They don't just flip the switch and run out and hit you and act aggressive, and they're tough guys. Some of the most secure people are some of the calmest and self-assured people that you'll ever meet, because they don't need to inject their fear and assert the control over the environment, which you can't control anything except for yourself. So the idea of controlling the outside or people around you, that's totally a futile attempt, and you'll only get more and more frustrated the harder that you try to control everything, and the more you realize, oh, you silly goose, you can't control anything. You can barely control yourself. So why don't you work on that before trying to control all these other people? Now, just like violence comes from a lack of control and a desire to assert control over everything, over yourself, over other people, over the environment. You're attempting to really squeeze and enforce the way that you think things should be because it seems the safest for you. And on the opposite side of that coin, on the opposite side of violence, is kindness and freedom. And the idea that you're self-assured enough that you don't need to enforce control on everything, that everything else can exist as everything else, and that you are you, and regardless of what's happening with other people or what's happening around you, you are your own independent being that does not require any type of validation or it doesn't require other people to maintain yourself. And I don't mean, of course, you don't like when people tell you you're attractive or when people give you money. Of course, you're going to enjoy that, but you don't need it to not only be happy, but just to survive. And if you keep going down that path, and you see that violence is an extension of control and that kindness is an extension of freedom. And not only freedom for those around you, but freedom of yourself. The amount of extra energy and work it takes to be constantly in a state of terror that you have to control everything and everyone, that's a full-time job. Imagine freedom from all that, and freedom from worrying about how other people perceive you, freedom from worrying if you're going to survive or if you're going to be okay without the validation or approval of other people around you. That's very powerful. And that string of power obviously is very visible within violence. Violence is so clear and palpable, and the power of violence, you don't need to explain it to anybody. You hit someone in the face, oh, I understand. But kindness is just as powerful as violence, and I don't mean this in a kumbaya way. I mean that they are two heads of the same coin, that they are two faces of the same mountain. And there's not one side of the mountain that's stronger than the other side of the mountain. There's not one side of the coin that's more valuable than the other side of the coin. As two faces of the same coin, there's additional features that you'll see in a pattern. They're totally opposite of each other. When you think about violence and control, that's repellent. You don't want to be near somebody that's that way. You don't want to go to their house. You don't want to be in a relationship with them. The opposite of violence and control is kindness and freedom, which is magnetic. People are drawn towards freedom and kindness in a way that is just as powerful as violence. You can compel someone's behavior. You can enforce and force people to behave the way you want, but you're not really changing them. Whereas kindness goes a layer deeper. Kindness can change them and their own internal motivations. So instead of having someone have to be there, having to enforce control, kindness doesn't require enforcement. Kindness is powerful enough to exist independently without an actor to enforce it. Obviously, people don't make armies and weapons of mass kindness. That doesn't seem to be effective in the world. It's pretty effective when you go and you drop a bunch of bombs and soldiers and guns, and that is a undeniably good card to play. And if there is another side of the card, why doesn't anybody play that? Why don't you see that happening in a successful way if they're just as powerful? Well, it's because you can't measure them in an apples to apples way. You can't get a scale and see as a 1-to-1 ratio, because the balance is not the same as being 100% equal. They're balanced on different planes and in different ways. As you see more of these patterns repeating on opposite sides of each other, between violence and kindness, control and freedom, they keep going deeper and deeper, even into the features of each of these expressions. And so you think about violence. Violence generally requires a large dose to be effective. You can't just usually pinch someone and rob them. You have to have a gun. You have to beat them. You have to do serious violence to really get things to change. And kindness requires much less potency to be effective. And you've had this done in your own life. Imagine you're trying to get a table at a restaurant, or you're trying to interact with someone who has something that you want. Now, you can use violence to get what you want, but you'd have to use generally a lot of violence to be able to win that obstacle. If you were to use kindness, generally a small dose of kindness is just as potent as a very large dose of violence. When you're at a customer service desk, you're trying to work with somebody, try being annoyed or angry. That will generally get you nowhere. Try being nice and kind, and that might get you a little bit further. And granted, you can bust in with a gun or a katana and you can force them to do whatever you want, but that is a much larger dose of violence than the relative dose of kindness. And you can see these features are patterns that, again, constantly are the opposite of each other. It's difficult to authentically believe that kindness can be as powerful as violence, because I know about the violence in my life. That was pretty powerful. And then I think about the kindness in my life, and it seems, not the same. The violence had so loud, and it speaks over everything, whereas the kindness is like such a quiet whisper. And I thought, well, if I'm going to try to understand more about what is the real authentic power of kindness, because nobody really needs to be convinced about the power of violence. And if the universe and reality is really balanced, then no matter where you look, you should be able to find that balance. And so, what's on the other side of the violence card? Because you can see the violence card got a lot on it. And you flip it over to kindness. What is at the bottom here? Because it doesn't seem as strong. So, to understand kindness and how it's expressed in one of its strongest modalities, I needed a control group. And I don't just mean in a scientific way. I mean, I needed a group of people to examine that were very controlled and that would oppress freedom, ambiguity, kindness, because if it's in an environment that's mostly violent, mostly controlling, how can kindness even exist there? And if it did exist there, wouldn't it be the strongest kind of kindness? Wouldn't it be significant if kindness existed in that kind of environment? Wouldn't it have some unique characteristics that you would know, wow, this is what a very powerful expression of kindness looks like? So, to go to the most controlling, violent environment that I'm aware of, had to look at death row. Solitary confinement, maximum security penitentiaries. These are for the felonies. You know what I'm saying? No misdemeanors here. And for kindness to exist in prison, oh my God, that must be very serious. So I looked at prisoners' responses to different prompts about kindness. I was able to find an essay done by Tracy Ziegler. And her work with prisoners and her interactions with them were to try to understand the same thing. And she's aware and has witnessed kindness occur in prisons, but she wanted to understand, what is the function of kindness in prison? Why is it here? And her work really helps to give some character to how kindness is a function of that culture. And she asked different prisoners to explain their experience and their observation with kindness. And she got several really interesting responses. Check out the next episode where I go through some of those responses. Don't forget to support the channel by picking up a hoodie. Thanks. Bye.